Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel where we talk about Hungarian true crime cases, and my name is Tímea. And first of all, I just have to address something. If I sound weird, that's because I'm sick. Now, I don't know if I have COVID or if I just have the common cold, but my voice is definitely rusty a little bit. Other than that, in my previous video's comment section, I asked some of my subscribers if you have any questions about Hungary, because I was thinking about making like a short supplementary guide to Hungary and to make my videos a bit more understandable. Do you have any questions? Let us know down in the comment section. As always, stay tuned for the Hungarian word of the day as well as the engagement question at the end of the video. Now, let's get started. Today I'm going to share with you the story of an innocent man who was falsely convicted for the brutal murder of his mother. This case took place in the city of Debrecen. It's a beautiful place with lots of tourist attractions. It's a very popular and big city that has its own agglomeration of multiple little towns and villages. It is quite far away from Budapest. I mean, depends on what you consider far. Since Hungary is a very small country, just about any distance is considered far. It was on the 7th of April 2007 that a woman named Balla Irma was murdered in her own house. And the next morning she was discovered by her own son. At the time, all we knew is that she was severely beaten with a heavy object, and in the end she was strangled to death, so strong that her throat, her larynx, was shattered to pieces. And this whole torture could have taken around 15 to 20 minutes. Now let's talk about who Irma was. She was this middle-aged lady and she used to be a teacher. I think she was either in a high school or an elementary school, I don't know that for sure. But she was always very involved with the life of her people, of her community. She always wanted the best for them and she was very interested in politics. And this is how she decided to run for party representative in Debrecen on the elections in 2006. And she was popular. She won the elections and she won by 63% of the voters. And unfortunately, she didn't really have enough time to show her potential and to fight for her views, because only 6 months later she was murdered. People described her as very stern and strict, and she was a maximalist. She definitely always expected the very best from herself, from her friends, family and colleagues. And she was also described as very stubborn, like you could not win an argument with her. She would not even really listen to your point. She would just walk away if your views didn't align. So yeah, I feel like I can relate to that. I'm very similar to that. I'm trying to improve. As you can see, her being involved in politics, her being kind of a popular figure in her town, that could have been a very good motive for someone to murder her. But we also cannot close out the possibility that it was somebody from her previous work as a teacher, maybe like an angry ex-colleague or an angry parent of her ex-students. There could have been so many motives to this murder, and the police still decided to go with the least expected and the most unfounded one, because her son was going to be investigated and charged and then convicted for the murder of his own mom. Now, who was Irma's son? Irma's son was a man named Schönstein Sándor. Now, I was trying to figure out how he pronounces his name, because in the German pronunciation I think it's Schönstein. But according to Hungarian phonology, it's supposed to be Schönstein. Now, I'm not sure how he prefers to pronounce it. He was born in 1978, so at the time of the murder he was 28, turning 29 soon. He also had a sister called Wanda, who was 2 years younger than him. And when the children were still young, the family lived happily together in their family home. However, when Sándor was old enough to go to high school, his parents decided to divorce. Luckily, this was an amicable separation, and their dad decided to move not very far from their previous family home. And the kids just had enough time to spend with their dads while still living with Irma at home. When Sándor graduated from high school, he decided to go to the University of Debrecen to become a programming mathematician. However, this was a very hard course, very demanding and stressful. So after 5 years of trying to graduate and finish this degree, he decided to quit and drop out. Now, as we have mentioned before, Irma was kind of a strict and stern woman, and she definitely never allowed her children to get bad grades at home. But it was such a surprise to Sándor when he dropped out of university. His mom was supportive and helpful, and she wasn't angry with him at all. In fact, she was the one to help him find a better course that was more suitable for him. So they together found this 2-year course that he graduated from, and then he was also accepted to the Corvinus University in Hungary, where he started a 4 or 5 year long course. At the time of the tragedy, he was in his 4th year, so he was very close to graduating from there as well. So as you can see, with all of these years adding up, Sándor was still a university student at the age of 28. Now let's talk about the events of the last day. These are the version of events of Sándor. It was on Good Friday in 2007 that Sándor decided to go from his university in Budapest back to his hometown in Debrecen to spend the Easter holidays and the spring vacation with his family. So he arrived at the train station in the early afternoon, and Irma went to pick him up by car. On the way back home, Sándor told his mom that this night he was not going to be at home with her because he was going to go to a barbecue and a bonfire in a nearby small town or village called Bagamér, where he was going to be with his friends just to start the spring break off a good note. His friend came to pick him up by car at around 6 p.m. to go to this city, to the barbecue. And Sándor said that the last memory he had of his mom, Irma, was that she gave him a banana, so he doesn't have to go hungry for too long in case the barbecue isn't ready to eat in time. He got to this barbecue where everything was just fine. He was having fun with his friends, drinking some beer around the bonfire, and it never occurred to him that he should call his mom or check on her, because if anyone was gonna check on the other, that would be the worrying mom and not the other way around. The only phone call that he had that night was at around 8 p.m. when his dad called Sándor to let him know that his dad was going to go to yet another town nearby in the countryside to spend the weekend with the father's side of the family, and that Sándor was invited. So Sándor knew that his weekend plans was going to go to his father's side of the family. But he was still at the barbecue, so he just hung up on his dad and then went on to enjoy the night. It was between midnight to 1 a.m. that the barbecue ended, and he got a lift back home to Debrecen by his friend. And he wanted to enter the home, but he couldn't. Now let me explain. The front yard had a fence and a gate. And then at the house there were 2 doors. I don't know if you have this system in other countries, but in Hungary it's kind of common to have an outside door, a first door, and then an inside door or second door. And Sándor had the keys to the gate as well as to the first door, so he could just unlock those no problem. But he didn't have the key to the second door, which was locked. And this was kind of weird because Irma never used to keep the inside second door locked. It was always unlocked because having the gate and the first door closed was enough for safety reasons. And therefore, he just couldn't get inside. Now, this would normally be enough to raise alarm, but not during this time, because in their next door neighbor, there was a construction going on. So Irma decided to always keep all of the gates and the doors locked for safety reasons. So Sándor was stuck outside, trying to call his mom on the phone. She didn't pick up. Tried to ring the doorbell, knock on the door, knock on the windows, no answer. And this didn't immediately worry Sándor, because his mom used to take sleeping pills on a regular basis, and Sándor just assumed that Irma must have been in such a deep slumber that she just simply didn't wake up to all of that noise. So Sándor had no other choice than to go down to their cellar and spend the night there. He just made this makeshift bed of garden chairs and of some old blankets that they kept in the cellar. And he just slept there. Now, the next morning he woke up early, and it was so early that he assumed that if his mom really took sleeping pills the night before, then she still wouldn't be awake. And Sándor didn't want to wake her up, didn't want to bother her, so he just decided to call his dad so that they would go to that town where they were going to spend the weekend with his father's side of the family. And that is exactly what he did. Though during the day, he tried to reach his mom countless times. He kept calling her, texting her, asking people to go and knock on the door, and there was no answer. So he grew really worried. Something was not right. He decided to just ditch this family reunion and just go back to Debrecen, and he broke down the door to see what was wrong with his mom. And he still didn't think that he was gonna be dead. He thought that she was just unconscious or had a minor accident or got into some kind of minor trouble, but he didn't think of murder immediately. And who would? Other than me, because now I have a true crime channel. I think murder would be in my top 5 concerns if somebody doesn't answer the phone for a long time. And he entered the house, and what he saw was the one that he least expected. His mother was dead on the floor, cold, stiff, in a pool of her own blood, and the whole room was covered in blood from floor to ceiling. Her pajama pants were thrown next to her body, and her underwear was put on inside out, and her genitals were allegedly somehow mutilated or harassed, though it is not for sure if she was raped or not. We don't know if she was penetrated or not. So Sándor obviously called the police right away. And the first responder who got to the scene told him not to be surprised that now he would be the prime suspect in the eyes of the police. And this is often the case. We have seen it countless times, that the person who discovers a murder and calls the police will be the first suspect. And that isn't necessarily a problem. The investigators don't know that you're innocent or not. They have to investigate you and close you out of the possibilities. And Sándor was a smart man. He knew that. He understood what position he was in. And he was okay with that. He knew that he was gonna be investigated, and he knew that he would be closed out as a suspect. Well, he wasn't. Because it really didn't help his situation that he was a very calm, cool, and collected person. His voice was entirely emotionless when he made the phone call to the police. And when they got to the scene, he was so unshaken. I'm not gonna lie, I would think that's suspicious too. He was taken in for questioning, and he voluntarily did a polygraph test, though he was never given the results of that test. And he theorized in a later interview that it must have been because he passed with flying colors, and the police didn't like that. It didn't fit their narrative of him being a prime suspect, so they just simply never gave him the results. I don't even know if that's legal or not. The police, you can see that they just cherry-picked the evidence that fit their narrative. Talk about confirmation bias. But the investigation came to a halt and the police couldn't really produce any evidence for Sándor or anyone else. And for a year, everything seemed fine, like so to speak. But of course, the family wasn't able to start the healing and the grieving process without knowing who the killer was and what the motive was. It wasn't until more than 1 year later, when Sándor and his sister were living together in an apartment in Budapest, that one morning a commando squad just broke into their apartment and just took Sándor out of the bed while he was still half asleep. He didn't even really have time to pack his stuff. It was early in the morning and Wanda was freaking out. She was crying hysterically, and Sándor has no choice but to go with this commando squad because he was arrested in suspicion for the murder of his mom. And then they transferred him in these police vans or these SWAT vans from Budapest to Debrecen, which is quite a ride, and he was handcuffed the whole time in his pajamas and probably hungry, thirsty, fucking uncomfortable. And the investigators the whole time during this car ride were trying to persuade him to confess to the murder. But Sándor said that he wasn't going to confess to something he never committed. So he was detained for a long time. And during the whole time, his sister and his aunt were working so hard to find the best lawyer that they could just afford. And luckily they did. He got a very good and very famous Hungarian lawyer who had won pretty much every case ever. But just imagine this feeling that he must have had, that this whole year there was this uncertainty of who killed his mom and why the police was investigating him, why couldn't just close him out of the suspects. And he's there, detained, and he had this feeling of hopelessness, what the fuck is going on? Why is this happening to me? Why don't the investigators and the police see that I am not involved in this murder? There was no evidence against him. He just thought that it was a bad, terrible nightmare that he was gonna wake up from. He thought that it was a prank, a joke, and that any second somebody could just tell him that, this was just a joke, you're free to go. And his trial started, and on the first day of the trial, and then the second day of the trial, and then every single day of the trial, he just kept thinking that this was a terrible nightmare and it was gonna just suddenly come to an end. And I cannot emphasize that he had no evidence. The only evidence that the persecution had against him was kind of fabricated. First of all, he had an alibi. He didn't really have a good motive. He didn't really have the opportunity or the murder weapon. And he was convicted based on one single piece of evidence that the fibers from his clothes were abundantly present in the fibers of her mom's clothes. God damn it, a son and daughter obviously are gonna have clothes fibers from each other on the other person's body, when they hug, or just living together, or washing their clothes in the same washing machine. What kind of evidence is that? And his trial lasted for about 2 years, and I cannot believe my own ears when I tell you that he was in the end sentenced to 12 years in prison on the 11th of May 2010. His family and his lawyer worked so hard on his retrial, and thank God that they could appeal his sentence and get a fair trial. Because let me tell you all of the inconsistencies in this case. First of all, Irma always used to keep her cell phone, those old cell phones. She used to keep it on a neck chain that she never took off. She was a politician, she was a teacher, she was a mom, she had a busy social life, she was constantly on the phone, she made phone calls several times a day. So she just kept it in her neck. And when she took Sándor from the train station home, she still had it in her neck. People saw it in the convenience store that she still had it in her neck. And then when she said goodbye to Sándor when he was gonna go to the barbecue, she still had it in her neck. And when Sándor was away at the barbecue in a different town, she made phone calls from her cell phone, right? But poof, the next morning when her body is discovered, the cell phone is gone. Interesting. But not only that, an MP3 player, the house keys, and some cash was also missing from the scene. The prosecution tried to explain this detail of the missing phone away, saying that, Irma must have just lost it. The phone that was literally tied to her body 24/7, that she made phone calls from after her son left the house. She just lost it, I guess. And out of these 365 days, she just happened to lose her phone hours before her murder. I see, prosecution, that you are a bunch of asshats, because there is evidence that she didn't lose her phone. Like, the prosecution's theory in this is an actual lie, because after the murder took place, the phone went on a walk. The cell phone information showed that this phone pinged on multiple phone towers and that phone calls were made from it. So the police tracked down this phone based on the cell phone information and found it dug in the ground on the other end of the city at an abandoned construction site. Sándor didn't have the time or the motive to do that at all. And the police did such a shit work during the investigation. First of all, they failed to collect DNA evidence. When Irma's body was taken for an autopsy, it was transferred in this blanket. But they just simply discarded of this blanket, as if the killer's evidence couldn't have been present on this blanket, like it couldn't have transferred to it. They just discarded of this freaking piece of huge evidence. Second of all, whatever DNA evidence they did have did not match Sándor's DNA. And third of all, suddenly, interestingly, mysteriously, all of this evidence that they did collect suddenly went missing when they were transferring it between two labs. Like, poof, gone. The prosecution, despite of all of this evidence and apparent inconsistencies, really kept pushing their agenda that Sándor could have been the only murderer, that his motive was that his mom was just too strict and he couldn't stand it anymore. But first of all, there are a lot of strict parents on this planet, and that isn't an immediate motive for murder. Second of all, Sándor was an adult man who had lived far away from his mom in a different city for years, so it's not even as if he had to endure this kind of alleged strictness and abuse from his mom on a daily basis. Either way, the prosecution's version of events was that just before he went to the barbecue, he had an argument with his mom and bludgeoned her to death and then strangled her and apparently sexually harassed her, and then just take all of these things that he otherwise didn't really need. He walked across the whole city and dug the phone while also simultaneously being at the barbecue in a different town. And then in the next morning, he just tried to cover it up. Like, this doesn't make much sense. And really, the only thing that the prosecution story could stand on was that Sándor was such a calm and cool and collected person, and he always spoke and acted so emotionless. But we have seen it 100 times. I would expect investigators and psychologists and the prosecution to know from all people that a lot of the times people don't react to grief and shock and trauma the same way. What if he was raging inside but he was unable to show these emotions? Not to mention that his sister Wanda took it so hard that he wanted to be this stronger, bigger brother to her. And in his situation as a person being tried for the murder of his mom, he could not afford to lose his shit. He had to be composed. So people just assume the worst without knowing anything about someone's background and why they feel or behave the way they do. And the final point that the prosecution based their case on is that Sándor used to like violent video games as a teenager, and it must have fed his aggressive, murderous instincts. Can you point to one teenager or young man who doesn't like violent video games? Because I have never seen one. Does that mean that someone is inherently a murderer? Because when I used to play Sims, I would always kill the parents of the teenagers so they could live alone and make house parties all the time. Does that mean that I'm a murderer? And it took 2.5 years for Sándor's lawyer to gather all of the lost evidence and get new evidence and debunk the false evidence to give him a fair trial. And when all of this evidence was presented to the judge, suddenly the prosecution story was just a pile of shit. They had nothing in their hands, their case collapsed. And thank God, after 2.5 years spent innocently in prison, Sándor was acquitted and let free on the 12th of September 2013. 6 years after his mom's murder, he was finally free of all of this. This man was emotionally, physically tortured and drained. I just imagine being in prison at all, and then imagine being there as an innocent man. Imagine being there with this doubt, like, what really happened? Why am I here? How is this even happening? It must have been so hard for him. Luckily, he was kind of protected by the prison guards, like he wasn't abused as much as other prison mates were. So at least that's a tiny bit of a positive note. And all the things that this poor man lost. His long-term relationship ended when he was let out of prison because his girlfriend just couldn't take it anymore. They already had very different lives, I can only imagine that. And I'm not blaming that woman either. It must have been really hard for her too. And also, Sándor wasn't able to finish that university course that he was so close to graduating from, because by the time he was out of prison, that course was discontinued. And he was never able to work in his field that he studied for so many years. All the things that they took from him, honestly. It's fucking unfair. But okay, you must be wondering, so if we know that Sándor wasn't the murderer, then who was? Now get this. In 2009, a man named D. Lajos was caught for burglarizing several homes in the city. And he was a construction worker, and he had committed multiple petty thefts and burglaries and robberies before. He was also a convicted drug user. At the time of Irma's murder, he used to work as an illegal construction worker at the construction site next to Irma's house. He had been witnessed peeking through Irma's windows that he could clearly see from the construction site, because Irma didn't have curtains on those windows, to see what he could steal from there. Always have curtains. Okay, I don't understand how people don't have curtains. I will never not have curtains. And then one night he decided that he was gonna burglarize that home. He had seen what he wanted to steal, and he took a crowbar from the construction. Now, I'm not sure how he actually entered the home, but I know for a fact that from the construction site he could easily trespass Irma's garden. And then maybe he just happened to find all of the doors unlocked, or he was able to break in, or he forced his way inside in other ways. But in the end, he was in the house late at night when Irma was trying to sleep. Now, he always used to do drugs before his burglaries, so he must have been in a different kind of mental state. And when Irma saw him standing in the hallway, like burglarizing the home, putting away all of the valuables, she just shouted at him like, "What the fuck are you doing and who are you?" He decided that the best way to go about things and to get out of the situation was to just beat her with the crowbar. And he beat her terribly. At some point, he possibly raped or harassed her sexually, and in the end, he strangled her to death. And then he took an MP3 player, her cell phone, all the cash that he could find. He closed all of the doors and the gates behind him and just walked home like nothing happened. He walked all the way to that construction site where he made a phone call and dug it in the ground. And the worst part of all of this is that this happened in 2009, while Sándor's trial was going on. Lajos, the actual murderer, confessed to the murder of Irma 2 times, and yet it was dismissed as evidence on Sándor's trial. So the judge and the police and the investigators were all aware that there was a man who already had previous charges, and he confessed to the murder 2 times, and yet they still kept on with this stupid story that Sándor somehow murdered his own mom. And do you know why it was dismissed as evidence? Because the judge said that Lajos was just a petty thief. He just looked like a petty criminal. He didn't look like a murderer. Excuse me? Does Sándor look like a murderer to you? And besides, since when do we give punishment based on someone's looks? And I'm not exactly sure what happened in those years between Sándor being let out of prison in 2013, but it wasn't until 2019 that Lajos was going to be convicted, and his sentence was finalized in 2020. So either his trial took 6 years or 7 years, or like there was not enough evidence against him, or there were some other issues, but this case wasn't 100% fully settled until last year. And this was also the time that the real murderers, Lajos' DNA was finally matched to the ones found at the scene, and that the real murder weapon was finally identified in the form of the crowbar. Now, all of those years later, there was no DNA evidence on it, as much as I know, but that was the only item that could have been used as a murder weapon, pretty much. And do you want to know the sentence that Lajos got in the end? Bitch, don't even get me started. For the brutal murder, the strangulation, the beating, and the possible rape, for burglarizing, stealing, entering and trespassing a home, this man got 15 years in prison. If you have watched any of my true crime cases so far, in my communist crime videos, if somebody was found guilty on Tuesday, they were dead by Friday. Like, they gave the death penalty within literally days. And now it takes 6-7 years for a man to be convicted, even though there is mounting evidence and a confession against him. And in the end, he goes with only 15 years for such a brutal crime of an innocent woman. And you wanna know what Sándor got as a compensation for being falsely convicted and spent 2.5 years in prison after losing his mom to a brutal murder and losing his education and his long-term relationship and everything that he has ever worked for? He got 10 million forints in compensation. That's about $33,000 now. Like, he could buy a new car. He could buy a quarter of a house or less. He could probably buy a land in the countryside. But like, what could he do with that much money, honestly? I really hope that he appeals and gets a lot more money in compensation, because that's nothing, honestly. With a well-paid job, had he finished his education, he could have made more money than that in those 2.5 years. Plus all the trauma. I mean, I know that money cannot bring back what he lost, but 10 million, like $30,000, let's be real, that's way less than he should have gotten. Moral of the story is that this could happen to any of you watching this video right now. You could be in the wrong place at the wrong time tomorrow, and something terrible like this could happen to literally anybody. So be grateful that so far you have been lucky enough and blessed enough to have your family, your friends with you, and that you haven't been served this terrible injustice. Just a few days ago, I watched this movie on Netflix. It was called Trial by Fire. It was a great movie, very good actors, great storyline, but I don't want to spoil it for you in case you haven't seen it, but it was just so emotionally draining, sad, terrible, and just the knowledge and the understanding that this has happened, is happening, and will happen to countless people in the future. And as you can see, even forensic evidence isn't enough sometimes, because if the investigators in a prosecution had decided that you are guilty, they will do everything in their power to prove that. And sometimes they win. And I just want you guys to always be grateful for what you have and you don't have. Because I don't know, I feel like covering these cases, I always learn so much about the world. And I am just so happy and blessed that I am not in that position. So that is all that I can tell you about this case. I hope that my raspy voice wasn't a distraction. And today's Hungarian word of the day is going to be for innocent. It's ártatlan. 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 And today's engagement question is: what movie or book or series has changed your life and your outlook on things, whether for the worse or for the better? Well, I have a lot of answers that I could give, but the first one that came to my mind was Black Mirror. That series really changed my hopes and dreams about my future. If any of those things come true in my lifetime, we are doomed. Like, if you haven't seen Black Mirror, maybe don't. You will lose all hope. What is it for you? Let us know down in the comment section, as well as all of your other opinions on this case. And before I forget, please make sure to leave if you have any questions about Hungary, our language, the people, the traditions, the country, down in the comment section, so I can make a video about it if people are interested. Please don't forget to like this video, it helps me out a lot. And subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and I see you next time. Bye!